Hello and welcome back to another EDH gameplay here on this channel. Before we get into the gameplay, I want to make a quick shout out to Kaiju Cards in Trier, Germany for providing a great place for us where we can play our TCGs. We are back with the Lost Cavern of Ixalan Precons, and since nobody else wanted to play it, I am back playing Clavileño, First of the Blessed, as Vampire Tribal deck. Since it has been a while since our last episode, Christopher did a few adjustments to Admiral Brass Unsinkable, but the table was totally fine with it, so he's playing an upgraded version of her. Jan saw the Dino deck and immediately went for it, so he's playing Discover Dinos, and Anton is playing Hakbal of the Surging Soul, representing the Merfolk tribe. So I'd say let's get right into the gameplay. I start us off and I draw for my turn. I play a Windbrisk Hides and hide away 4. I hide a card and I pass the turn. Christopher draws, plays a Thriving Moor for turn and chooses blue as additional color. Anton plays a command tower and Jan draws for his turn, playing an unclaimed territory naming dinosaurs. He taps it for a Soul Ring, and afterwards he passes the turn. I untap and draw. I play a Swamp as land for turn, and I tap 2 to play an Orzhov Signet. Afterwards I pass the turn. Christopher untaps and draws for his turn. Plays a mountain, taps 2, and plays a Warkite Marauder. He passes the turn. Anton draws, plays an island as land for turn, taps 2 and plays a Kiora's Follower. He passes the turn. Jan untaps, plays a forest as land for turn. He taps 4 mana total and casts a Runic Armosaur. He passes the turn, so I untap, draw for my turn, play a Plains as land for turn, and here I tap 3 mana total to cast a Welcoming Vampire. I tap my Swamp to cast a Indulgent Aristocrat. That triggers my Welcoming Vampire, so I draw a card. Afterwards I pass the turn, so Christopher untaps and draws. He attacks Jan with his Warkite Marauder, and Jan takes 2. Second main he plays a Smoldering Marsh tapped and passes the turn. Anton untaps and draws for his turn. He taps an island for blue, plays a Simic Growth Chamber bouncing the island, using Kiora's Follower to untap the Growth Chamber, and taps his remaining lands to cast his commander Hakbal. Afterwards he goes to combat and chooses Hakbal to trigger first for his Explore trigger. He finds a non-land permanent which he puts into the graveyard and puts a +1/+1 counter on Hakbal. Afterwards Kiora's Follower follows up, and then he sees another non-land permanent which he puts into the graveyard to give Kiora's Follower a +1/+1 counter. Then he passes the turn, so Jan untaps, draws for his turn. He plays another forest as land for turn. Then he taps a total of 4 mana and casts a Raging Retisaur. He goes to combat and swings his Runic Armosaur at Christopher. Christopher takes it, and then he passes the turn, so I untap, I draw for my turn. I tap a total of 3 mana to cast my commander, Clavileño. When he enters, it triggers my Welcoming Vampire, so I draw a card. Then I move to combat, and my Aristocrat also attacks Christopher. On attack, I create a Vampire Demon token underneath the Aristocrat. Christopher takes it, so he loses 1 and I gain 1. I pass the turn and Christopher untaps. He draws for turn, and he immediately goes to combat and attacks Anton for 2. He takes it, and in his second main phase Christopher casts a Commander Sphere. He passes the turn, so Anton untaps and draws for his turn. He plays a forest as land for turn. He taps a total of 3 mana to cast a Topography Tracker, so he doubles all of his Explore triggers. On ETB he creates a map token, he uses his Kiora's Follower to untap his Growth Chamber, which triggers Runic Armosaur, so Jan draws a card. Anton taps another 3 to cast Kumena, Tyrant of Raska. He moves to combat, so he gives his Kiora's Follower the first Explore trigger, gets a land to hand. Second trigger, he finds a non-land card on top, puts a counter on his follower and throws the card into the graveyard. He continues with Hakbal. He finds another non-land card, puts a +1/+1 counter on Hakbal, puts the card into the graveyard, gets his second trigger, finds another non-land permanent, puts the counter on Hakbal, and puts the card into the graveyard. He continues with Kumena, finds another non-land permanent, puts a counter on Kumena and puts it into his graveyard. Afterwards he finds another non-land permanent which he's interested in, so he keeps it on top and puts the remaining +1/+1 counters on all of his merfolks. He declares his attacks and attacks me with Hakbal. On attack he puts an island into play. I decide to take the commander damage and take 6 commander damage from him. In his second main phase he uses 1 mana to crack the map token to let Hakbal explore twice again. He passes the turn. Jan untaps and draws for his turn. He plays a Keswick Wolf Run as land for turn. He taps a total of 3 mana for Raging Raptors. He goes to combat and attacks Christopher, which is Raging Regisaur, and on attack he pings his own Raging Raptors to get an Enrage trigger and find a basic land to the field tapped. Christopher takes the damage, he finds a mountain, and in his second main phase he taps more mana to cast a Sunfrill Imitator. He passes the turn, so I untap, draw for my turn. I tap a total of 3 mana to cast my own Commander Sphere, and then I tap 2 more to cast a Bloodghast. On ETB it triggers my Welcoming Vampire, so I draw a card. I move to combat and I attack Anton with my Welcoming Vampire. That triggers Clavileño, so I create another Vampire Demon token underneath my Welcoming Vampire. Anton takes it, so I pass the turn. Christopher untaps, draws for his turn. He plays a Rogue's Passage as land for turn. He taps a total of 5 mana to cast his commander, Admiral Brass Unsinkable. On ETB he mills 4 cards. He mills 3 lands and a Wayfarer's Bauble. So a really bad hit for him. After that he passes the turn and Anton untaps. Anton draws for his turn, plays an island as land for turn. He taps a total of 4 to cast Herald of Secret Streams. He uses Kiyora's Follower to untap his Growth Chamber again, which triggers Runic Armor Source, so Jan draws a card. Anton taps another 3 to cast Sage of Fables. Afterwards he goes to combat and gets a lot of Explore triggers. Finds a non-land card on top which he's interested in, so he puts +1/+1 counters on all of his creatures. Anton declares his attacks afterwards. He attacks me with 2 merfolks which are unblockable due to the Herald. On attack he decides with Hakbal to draw a card. I take a total of 12 damage unblockable, and Jan takes a total of 10 commander damage unblockable. Afterwards Anton passes the turn, so Jan untaps, draws for his turn. He taps a mountain and a few more lands and is Soaring to cast a Quartzwood Crasher. Afterwards he goes to combat and his Sunfrill Imitator attacks Anton, so it becomes a copy of Quartzwood Crasher. His Raging Regisaur also attacks Anton and uses his 1 ping damage on the Herald, so he would force a trade. Anton blocks the Raging Regisaur with his Fable and takes the remaining 6 damage from the Imitator, so Jan creates a 6/6 Trample Dinosaur. Afterwards he passes the turn, so I untap. I draw for my turn. I float a mana with my Commander Sphere and then I immediately crack it to draw a card. In addition to the 1 floating, I tap 3 more mana to cast a Blood Tracker. On ETB, it triggers my Welcoming Vampire, so I draw another card. I go to combat and I attack Anton with my Welcoming Vampire. He takes it, and then I have to move to discard and I discard 2 creature cards. Christopher untaps, draws for his turn. He plays a Secluded Courtyard as land for turn and chooses Pirates. He also floats a mana and cracks his Commander Sphere to draw another card. He uses the floating mana and 2 additional to cast a Forerunner of the Coalition. He tutors a pirate card to the top of his library, which is Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator. He puts it on top and passes the turn. Anton untaps, draws for his turn. He taps 3 mana to cast a Pantlaza, God of the Sea. He uses Kioro's Follower to untap his Simic Growth Chamber. That triggers Runic Armor Source, so Jan draws a card. And he moves to combat and gets a lot of Explore triggers. He finds a land to hand, finds another land to his hand. He continues with his Merfolks. He finds a non-land card on top that he doesn't want to keep, so he puts it onto his graveyard. Finds another non-land permanent. And he keeps it and just continues putting on +1/+1 counters on all of his Merfolks. Then he moves to declare attackers and Hakbal attacks Jan for lethal damage, and he throws another 2 Merfolks at me, which are also unblockable due to his Herald. On attack he uses the Hakbal trigger to put a forest into play, and this is how Jan dies due to commander damage. I have to take 16 damage from the unblockable Merfolks. Then we go to his second main phase. Anton taps all of his remaining mana to cast a Curse of the Swine for X = 4, and he exiles a few creatures of Christopher and 2 creatures of mine, my Welcoming Vampire, Clavileño, and the Forerunner of Christopher and Admiral Brass. After that he passes the turn, so I untap and draw. I move to combat and my Aristocrat attacks Anton. He takes the damage, so I gain 1 and he loses 1, and afterwards I pass the turn. Christopher draws for his turn. Christopher taps 4 mana to cast Ramirez de Petro Pillager. He loses 2 life and creates 2 treasure tokens on ETB. Afterwards his Warkite Marauder attacks Anton for 2 in the air. Anton takes it and that triggers Ramirez, so he gets the top card of Anton's library. After that, Christopher passes the turn, so Anton untaps. He gets an upkeep scry trigger from Pantlaza, keeps the card on top, draws it for turn, then remembers to untap his lands. Then he taps 2 mana to cast a Master of the Pearl Trident. After that he taps his remaining mana to cast a Kindred Discovery. Then he moves to combat and he chooses his Master first with his Explore triggers. He puts a few non-land cards into his graveyard and spreads the love with +1/+1 counters on his Merfolks. Continues with Kioro's Follower, finds another non-land card, puts a +1/+1 counter on it, explores the next time, finds another card, puts it into his graveyard and another +1/+1 counter on his follower. Continues with another Merfolk, puts his next card into the graveyard, puts even more +1/+1 counters on his cards, finds a land to hand, continues with his tracker, +1/+1 counter on it, Arcane Signet into the bin, continues, finds a land to hand, his Herald continues, and then he finds a non-land card that he's interested in, so for his remaining triggers he keeps the card on top. After all of these Explore triggers he declares his attackers. Hakbal and Komena attack Christopher, they are still unblockable, and his Herald and his Tracker attack me. He gets 4 triggers from Kindred's Discovery, so he draws 4 cards. And he uses the Hakbal trigger to put a land onto the battlefield. He chooses an island. Before blockers I tap 4 mana and I other end his Herald. He uses Kioro's Follower to untap his Simic Growth Chamber, and then he uses 2 mana to make one of the Merfolks that is attacking me unblockable. He uses the Tracker, so I will die to unblockable damage, and then his Herald gets exiled by my other end. Christopher is now able to block the 2 Merfolks that are attacking him with his boars, and this is how I die. Afterwards Anton plays a Temple of Mystery and scries 1 to the bottom. Afterwards he passes the turn and Christopher untaps. Christopher draws for turn. Christopher attacks with his Warkite Marauder. And Anton uses his 1 blue mana to in response kill his Ramirez with Rabbit Hybridization. He destroys Ramirez, and for that he gets a free Frog Lizard. Then Anton takes 2 from the Warkite Marauder, and Christopher passes the turn. Anton scries due to Tassa, and puts the card on the bottom. He draws for turn, and he moves to combat, and he gets a few more explore triggers, puts a land to hand, finds a growth spiral on top, but this is where the table realizes, or Anton realizes, that he can keep the cards on top, spread a few more +1/+1 counters, and then he will swing for the win. Due to his master and Christopher having an island on the field, all of his merfolks have island walk, so Christopher dies to an army of merfolks. We all say GG and congrats to Anton, and we are still amazed by the consistency of the Merfolk Precon deck. When it comes to the combo or the play of the game, we were all on the same page that it was the consistency of Anton always using his Kiora's follower. On turn 3 he tapped an island to gain 1 blue mana, followed it up with a Simic Growth Chamber which bounced the island to his hand, and then he used his Kiora's follower to untap the Simic Growth Chamber to use it for even more mana and bring out his commander on turn 3. Throughout the whole game he used his Kiora's follower to do this and generated a lot of value with that. Overall, I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about it, what we did great, what we didn't do so great, and then I would say see you in the next episode. Goodbye guys.